The history of the Deep South before the Civil War is one steeped in both brutality and survival, where the land and its crops became inextricably linked with the exploitation of human lives. At the heart of this history is cotton. Cotton was not merely a crop. It was the foundation of the Southern economy, the lifeblood of an entire region, and the driving force behind an entire system of oppression. In the years leading up to the Civil War, the cotton industry was flourishing, producing vast quantities of the fiber that fed both domestic and international textile mills. It was often said that cotton was king in the South, and with good reason. It shaped the wealth and power of the southern states, particularly in areas like Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. However, the cultivation of this golden crop came at an enormous human cost. The labor to grow and harvest the cotton was carried out by enslaved people, men, women, and children, who were forced into grueling work from the first light of day until the sun dipped below the horizon. For these individuals, life was defined by the repetitive and physically demanding tasks they had to perform daily in the fields. The plantation system relied heavily on forced labor, with hundreds of thousands of enslaved people toiling under the harsh supervision of overseers who wielded physical punishment as a tool to maintain control. The daily life of an enslaved person was one filled with exhausting work, fear, and constant threat of violence. Yet beneath this grim reality, there were untold stories of survival, rebellion, and moments of profound human connection. Enslaved people lived through an oppressive system that saw them as nothing more than property tools to fuel the engine of the Southern economy. They were forced to work from sunrise to sunset, in the sweltering heat of the cotton fields. The sound of the overseer's horn was the signal that the workday had begun, and it was a signal that there would be no rest until the sun set. In between long hours of bending over to pick cotton, they often had little time for basic human needs like eating, bathing, or spending time with their families. Despite these conditions, enslaved people managed to carve out small moments of humanity. They formed families and built communities within the confines of their harsh lives. They celebrated informal marriages, often symbolized by a simple yet meaningful ritual of jumping the broom, a tradition that represented their commitment to each other in a world that refused to recognize their unions as legitimate. These small acts of defiance were not just expressions of love, but of resistance, a refusal to let the system strip away their dignity. Even amidst the brutal demands of their labor, enslaved people found ways to fight back. Resistance did not always look like outright rebellion. Sometimes it came in quieter forms, such as sabotaging the work they were tasked with, or feigning incompetence to delay their work. Some enslaved people even risked their lives to escape, seeking freedom in the northern states, or by stowing away on ships, hoping to escape the chains of slavery and find a life where they could live freely. However, there were also moments of joy. Despite the constant threat of separation from their loved ones, enslaved people formed tight-knit families that looked after one another. They passed down stories, songs, and spirituals, ways to preserve their culture and create a sense of belonging in a world that tried to destroy both. These songs were more than just melodies. They were a form of expression, a way to communicate feelings of sorrow, hope, and resilience. For many, music and religion became sources of strength, lifting their spirits in ways that the brutal system could not suppress. Today we look back at these histories with both sorrow and admiration. The resilience of the enslaved people on these cotton plantations is a testament to the enduring human spirit. Their survival was not just about enduring pain. It was about resisting, about finding hope, and about creating a sense of family and community in the face of unimaginable hardship. This is the untold story of life on a Deep South plantation, one of exploitation, endurance, resistance, and the quiet acts of defiance that helped lay the groundwork for eventual freedom. Join me as we explore the true story behind the lives of those who lived and died in the fields of the Deep South, and remember, their resilience in the face of oppression is a story worth telling, a story that shapes our understanding of the past and helps guide our path to a more just future. From the very first sounds of the horn that echoed through the morning air, enslaved people on the cotton plantations were thrust into a relentless cycle of work. The sun had barely begun to rise, but for the men, women, and children who toiled in these fields, the day had already started. Their bodies, sore from the day before, were expected to spring into action, picking cotton from the ground in the blazing heat, often without respite, for 12 to 14 hours straight. Some days, especially during harvest season, their work stretched far beyond the horizon of exhaustion, sometimes continuing well after the sun set under the dim light of a fading sky. Enslaved labor was the driving force behind the success of cotton plantations, and it was a life governed by the constant oversight of the overseers. Men placed in power by the plantation owners to ensure that every ounce of labor was extracted. These overseers were responsible for ensuring the enslaved people met their daily quotas, and they were often ruthless in their methods of control. Every movement was monitored. There was no space for error, and any sign of resistance or hesitation was met with swift and brutal punishment. The overseers would ride along the rows of cotton, always watching, always waiting for any sign of lagging behind, said one account from an enslaved man named James Williams. If you fell behind, it was not just a reprimand, it was a lash. They would whip you, sometimes with such force that it left scars that never healed. The day never seemed to end. No matter how hard you worked, even when the sun began to dip below the horizon, you were still expected to work, picking cotton under the fading light. James Williams' account paints a vivid and harrowing picture of the reality many enslaved people faced. The field was a place where pain and exhaustion were constant companions, but so too was the relentless supervision by overseers whose goal was to keep the workers in line physically and mentally. The overseers would ride through the rows of cotton like hunters tracking prey, ensuring that everyone stayed at the pace they set, driving them forward through sheer force of will. If someone stumbled, slowed down, or even paused to catch a breath, the overseers were quick to impose punishment, which could range from a stern word to a brutal whipping, a punishment that left both physical and emotional scars. This unyielding pace was not just about getting the job done, it was about control. The overseers made it clear that the workers' bodies were not their own. They were property, meant to serve the plantation's needs. Any deviation from the work schedule, any small act of rebellion or sign of slowing down, was perceived as defiance, and defiance was met with violent retribution. But the overseers were not just concerned with productivity. They were also driven by a deep-seated belief in the dehumanization of the enslaved people they supervised. To them, these men and women were no more than machines meant to work and produce. They were expected to work without complaint, without the luxury of basic human dignity, and any resistance was an offense that needed to be crushed. For the enslaved people, the cotton fields became a place where both the body and the spirit were broken down. There was no escape, one former enslaved person recalled. If you were lucky enough to finish your day, you had no time to rest. You had to hurry to feed yourself, take care of your children, and tend to any other chores. If you did not do that, then the next day would be harder. And the work was not just physical, it was also deeply monotonous. Every day, the same repetitive motions, bending down, picking cotton, placing it in sacks, only to do it again the next day. The monotony was grueling in its own right, making the work feel endless, a cycle that wore down both the body and the mind. When you live under such conditions for days, months, and years, it becomes difficult to even imagine another reality, another way of life. The enslaved people who worked in these fields were not just picking cotton. They were picking the thread of their own survival, each action a small step towards sustaining their will to live. And even when the day came to an end, the exhaustion did not necessarily stop. The long hours of grueling labor were not followed by rest or relaxation. Enslaved people were expected to keep working long after the sun had set. There were no proper breaks, no time to relax, no time to simply exist. They had to move quickly from the cotton fields to the gin house to weigh their cotton and deliver it to the necessary storage. This was not a peaceful task. It was one done in fear. If an enslaved person did not meet their quota, the overseers would punish them on the spot, often with lashes or other forms of violent correction. The constant threat of punishment loomed over every enslaved person's head. It was not enough to just survive the day's work. They had to survive the overseer's demands and the weight of the system. There was no space for rest or rebellion, only for the relentless march of labor. The exhaustion was unrelenting, but so was the will to resist. Enslaved people found ways to rebel. In small and subtle ways, they sabotaged their work, deliberately dropping cotton or damaging equipment, anything to make the system more difficult to maintain. It was their quiet form of resistance, a refusal to accept the dehumanization that the plantation system forced upon them. This was not a revolution in the traditional sense, but it was a form of resistance that gave them a small measure of control in a life that offered none. And even when the workday was over, there was little rest. Enslaved people would return to their cabins, but their chores did not end. They still had to tend to their families, prepare meals with meager rations, and deal with the emotional toll of a life where every day was a struggle to survive. But even amidst all this, they formed families. They bonded. They found moments of joy. And they resisted, not just in the fields, but in their everyday lives. Their strength, their determination, and their humanity were never fully crushed by the cotton fields. And that resilience is what allowed them to survive in a system built to break them. The work in the cotton fields may have been endless, but so was the spirit of those who worked there. Once the grueling day's work was done, the enslaved people trudged back to their quarters, small, crude log cabins that offered little protection from the elements. These cabins were often damp, poorly constructed, and overcrowded, with families crammed together in tight spaces. The walls, usually made of rough-hewn timber, were inadequate at best, leaving them exposed to the cold winters, scorching summers, and relentless rains. The roofs, often leaky and patched with whatever materials were available, provided little shelter. Despite the hardships of working from dawn till dusk in the cotton fields, the harshness of their living conditions was perhaps even more unforgiving. Inside these cabins, the enslaved found no comfort. They slept on thin straw mattresses or directly on the cold wooden planks of the floor. Bedding was minimal. A single coarse blanket, often threadbare, was the only covering they had, and it would last them the entire year. For the children it meant sleeping on the same cold floors with no cushioning or protection. The air inside these cabins was heavy, with the smell of dampness and despair, and there was little to no chance of a peaceful night's rest. The constant fatigue from the day's work only compounded the discomfort of their meager living spaces. When it came to food, the situation was equally dire. A typical ration for an enslaved person consisted of a small amount of cornmeal and a few pounds of salt pork or bacon. This meager supply was supposed to sustain them through long, grueling workdays, but it rarely did. The food was bland and often insufficient, leaving many people hungry. The scarcity of vegetables or fresh produce made the meals even more inadequate, contributing to chronic malnutrition. The nutritional value was poor, and many enslaved people suffered from illnesses related to poor diet, such as scurvy or anemia, conditions exacerbated by their grueling labor and inadequate medical care. One woman, an enslaved mother, recalled the constant struggle to feed her children. "We had to wait for scraps," she said. "There were days when we had nothing but the remnants of what others did not want. I would wait until the evening, hoping to get enough to feed my children, but it was never enough. I did not just worry about their hunger. I was afraid constantly that one day my children would be taken away from me." Her fear was not just one of an empty stomach. It was a fear that haunted every mother on these plantations. Enslaved families were torn apart at the whim of their masters. At any given moment, a mother could have her child sold to another plantation or to an entirely different region, forever separating them. The psychological toll of living with this fear was devastating, as mothers not only fought to keep their children fed, but also grappled with the terrifying reality that they might never see them again. The threat of family separation was an ever-present shadow that loomed over their lives, one that haunted their every interaction and decision. The thought of losing a child, of watching them be carted off to a different life, perhaps without ever being able to say goodbye, was a constant source of anxiety and pain. The idea that a mother might never again hold her child, never again comfort them or protect them, was a wound that could never heal. Families were often forced to keep quiet about their fears, suppressing their pain because the system was designed to destroy any form of unity or solidarity. But even in the face of this crushing reality, they found ways to survive. Love, though often brief, was a force that helped enslaved people endure the horrors of their daily existence. Many mothers worked tirelessly to protect their children, teaching them how to survive in a world that treated them as nothing more than property. Despite the constant hunger, despite the backbreaking labor, and despite the looming threat of violence or separation, enslaved families did their best to hold on to some semblance of normalcy. Some families tried to grow small gardens outside their cabins, hoping that a few vegetables or herbs could supplement their meager diet. These tiny gardens were often all that stood between them and starvation. They grew whatever they could, sweet potatoes, peas, and sometimes a few herbs to add flavor to their bland meals. But even this small effort was precarious. The garden was at the mercy of the weather, and often the overseers would take whatever they could from the gardens, claiming it for the plantation's use. As the seasons changed, so did the risks. During the harvest, when the workload increased, enslaved people often faced the threat of being overworked or punished for falling behind. The fear of physical punishment was always in the air, as overseers used any excuse to lash out at those who did not meet their quotas. Enslaved people lived in constant terror of being punished, not just for mistakes, but for the mere suspicion of defiance. For women, the fear was even more profound. Not only were they subjected to the same brutal work conditions, but they also carried the additional burden of caring for their children under conditions that left them no time to rest. They were expected to meet the same grueling work quotas, while simultaneously fulfilling the roles of mother, caregiver, and homemaker in conditions that made even the simplest task a monumental challenge. One enslaved woman, recalling the immense pressure she faced, explained how her children would be the first to suffer if she failed to meet the demands of the workday. If I did not work fast enough, if I did not do enough, they would make me pay for it. They would take food away from my children, or they would punish me so I could not even take care of them at night. Her words spoke to the inherent injustice of the system, one where mothers had to choose between meeting the demands of their masters and caring for their own children. At night, the situation did not improve. When the sun went down, enslaved people were still not free from the oppressive weight of their existence. For many women, the end of the workday simply meant a new set of tasks. They had to prepare whatever meager meal they could, often working over an open fire with what little resources they had. Some women spent hours grinding corn into meal, a task that drained their remaining energy. These late-night chores were often performed in the dim light of a flickering candle or the dying embers of the fire, and yet they were as essential as the work done in the fields. And all the while, the fear of being torn from their families lingered. The possibility of being sold, of having to say goodbye forever to their children, haunted every moment of their lives. Enslaved mothers lived in a constant state of fear, knowing that any day could be the day their families were shattered beyond repair. But through all the hardships, enslaved people clung to one another. They formed deep connections, shared stories, and passed down wisdom. They created a sense of community out of nothing, resilient, defiant, and deeply human, despite the overwhelming forces arrayed against them. Their lives were marked by hardship, but also by love, hope, and an indomitable will to survive. Through their determination, their bonds, and their strength, they fought to hold on to what made them human, even when everything around them was designed to strip them of their humanity. The threat of punishment was ever present in the lives of enslaved people on cotton plantations. Every day, they worked in fear not just of the long, grueling hours in the fields, but of the punishment that awaited them if they did not meet the impossible expectations placed upon them. Whether it was failing to meet the daily cotton quotas, or simply being perceived as disobedient, physical violence was a constant threat. The lash of the whip became more than just a tool of discipline. It became a symbol of control, used to break both the body and the spirit of those who dared to defy or resist. For enslaved people, the daily grind of labor was only one part of their torment. The psychological toll of living in constant fear of punishment was perhaps even more devastating. The overseers were not just there to enforce the work, they were there to enforce an entire system of domination. Every crack of the whip, every angry word, was a reminder that the enslaved were not seen as human beings, but as property. Their worth was not measured by their humanity, their character, or their dignity. It was measured by their ability to work, to produce, to serve. This constant threat of violence had a profound psychological impact on the enslaved. It was not just the physical pain of being whipped or beaten. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of what might happen if they failed to meet their quotas, or if they dared to speak out or resist. The whip was not only a means of physical control, but a tool for shaping the enslaved person's mind. It was used to reinforce the idea that disobedience, or even perceived disobedience, was not just a mistake, it was a crime that warranted punishment. The psychological weight of this fear weighed heavily on every enslaved person, turning every day into a battle not just for survival, but for dignity, for autonomy, and for hope. One of the most devastating aspects of this constant fear was the fear of family separation. Enslaved people were always at risk of being sold away from their loved ones. Parents could have their children sold to another plantation, and spouses could be separated forever. This was not just a hypothetical fear. It was a daily reality. The idea of being torn away from their families was one of the deepest sources of trauma for enslaved people. Even a single day spent away from loved ones could feel like an eternity. And yet, despite this constant fear, enslaved people still formed deep, meaningful connections with one another. They created families, raised children, and loved one another, even though the system was designed to tear them apart. But no matter how strong the bond, no matter how deep the love, there was always the looming threat of separation, of having everything ripped away without warning. The overseers, acting as enforcers of this brutal system, were a constant reminder of the enslaved person's lack of agency. They were the physical embodiment of a system that sought to strip enslaved people of their autonomy and their humanity. The overseers were not simply people who told enslaved workers when to start and stop. They were the constant presence of fear, the reminder that the enslaved were constantly under surveillance. They were the ones who decided when and how punishment would occur, and they used this power to instill terror in the hearts of every worker. But the cruelty did not stop with physical punishment or the threat of separation. The mere presence of the overseer, watching from a distance, was a constant psychological burden. The overseers did not need to strike or yell every day. They only needed to be there, reminding the enslaved that they were always being watched. The constant surveillance became a part of their daily lives, creating a pervasive feeling of helplessness and powerlessness. Every action, every movement was scrutinized. The enslaved people could never relax. There was no space for peace, no space for freedom, because they were always under the watchful eye of someone whose sole purpose was to enforce the system of oppression. For some, the psychological toll of this constant surveillance was devastating. The fear of punishment, of not meeting expectations, became internalized. Enslaved people began to view themselves through the lens of the system that controlled them. Their self-worth was no longer tied to their identity as human beings, but to their ability to work, to perform, to produce. This mental framework was reinforced every day as they were punished for mistakes and rewarded for productivity. Over time, this process wore down their spirit, making them feel as though they were no longer individuals, but mere tools to be used and discarded. But it was not just the overseers who contributed to this mental strain. It was the system itself. The entire plantation economy relied on the belief that enslaved people were less than human, that they were not entitled to the same rights and dignity as their masters. This belief was ingrained not just in the overseers, but in the very fabric of society, shaping the way enslaved people saw themselves and their place in the world. The constant reinforcement of this dehumanization was designed to break their spirits, to make them feel small, powerless, and insignificant. And yet, even in the face of this crushing oppression, there were moments of resistance, however small. Enslaved people did not just endure, they fought back, in their own ways, and in their own time. Some resisted through small acts of sabotage, deliberately slowing their work, breaking tools, or damaging crops. These acts were a way of reclaiming some semblance of control over their lives, of asserting their humanity in a system that sought to deny it. Others resisted through quiet acts of defiance, like refusing to accept their assigned roles in silence. They formed bonds, shared knowledge, and passed down traditions. These small acts of resistance were not just about survival. They were about fighting back against the dehumanizing forces that sought to crush them. They were a way of telling the world, "You may control my body, but you cannot control my spirit." Despite the psychological and physical toll of life under slavery, many enslaved people managed to find ways to preserve their sense of identity, their sense of self-worth, through music, through family, through community. They found ways to resist, to endure, and to survive. These acts of resistance may have seemed small, but they were powerful proof that even under the most brutal conditions, the human spirit could not be fully broken. In the end, the system of slavery was designed to control every aspect of an enslaved person's life, their labor, their body, and their very identity. The lash of the whip was a tool of power, but it was also a tool of fear. It served to remind the enslaved that their worth was not their own. It was determined by how well they could serve the needs of their masters. But even as the system sought to break them, enslaved people found ways to fight back. The mental and emotional toll was immense, but their ability to resist and survive despite the odds is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Even in the face of extreme oppression, resistance among enslaved people took many forms: small acts of defiance, moments of quiet rebellion. In a system that sought to strip them of their identity, dignity, and autonomy, these acts of resistance were crucial to survival. The plantation system was designed to break the spirit and body of enslaved people, but they found ways, however subtle, to fight back. Some enslaved workers would deliberately make mistakes to sabotage the work process, while others might steal bits of cotton or food, small, seemingly insignificant acts that were, in truth, a powerful assertion of their agency and control over their own lives. One of the most common forms of resistance was what can be described as slowing down or dragging one's feet. Enslaved workers, often under the watchful eye of an overseer, would deliberately move slower than usual, making mistakes or performing tasks with deliberate inefficiency. These small acts of subversion were not open rebellions. There were no grand uprisings or public protests. Rather, these acts were quiet forms of protest, small, personal rebellions against a system that demanded their complete submission. This form of resistance was not about open rebellion, it was about survival. The enslaved were fully aware of the consequences of defiance, and any overt act of rebellion could lead to violent punishment or death. Instead, these acts of foot-dragging and subtle sabotage allowed enslaved people to regain a small measure of power in a system designed to strip them of it entirely. Each time an enslaved person delayed their work, damaged a tool, or performed a task poorly on purpose, they were asserting that, despite their status as property, they still had some control over their own actions. These small acts gave them a sense of autonomy in a world where they were meant to have none. In addition to these covert actions, many enslaved people would steal small amounts of cotton or food from the plantation. It was not enough to make a significant difference in the plantation's overall productivity, but it was enough to provide a tiny measure of control. For enslaved people, the ability to take something for themselves, whether it was a handful of cotton or a morsel of food, was a symbolic act of resistance. It was a refusal to be completely deprived of agency. In a world where they were denied basic human rights, stealing a small amount of food or cotton was a way to assert their humanity and maintain their dignity. They were not just laborers. They were people who had needs, desires, and a right to survive outside of the cruel system imposed upon them. The psychological significance of these acts cannot be overstated. In a system where everything from your labor to your body to your family was controlled by others, the ability to reclaim even the smallest amount of control was vital. It was a means of survival, not just in the physical sense, but in the emotional and psychological sense as well. Enslaved people lived under constant surveillance, subjected to the whims of their masters and overseers, and they knew that they had little power in the eyes of the law. But through small acts of defiance, they were able to regain some semblance of control over their lives, even if only for a moment. These forms of resistance were not without risk. While the consequences of being caught might not have been as severe as an open rebellion, they were still dangerous. The overseers were quick to punish any perceived failure to meet expectations, and a worker who deliberately slowed down or damaged tools could face beatings, lashes, or even worse. Yet the risk of punishment did not deter the enslaved from finding ways to resist. The stakes were high. Failure to comply could mean violent retribution, or, in some cases, death. But the need to maintain a sense of autonomy was stronger than the fear of punishment. There were other more covert acts of resistance as well. Enslaved people would often work together to subvert the system, whether through sharing knowledge of the land, helping one another hide food, or simply offering support in times of need. These small, hidden acts of solidarity were essential in maintaining a sense of community and resistance. Even in the face of overwhelming adversity, enslaved people found ways to support each other, to share what little they had, and to offer comfort and encouragement in a world that sought to destroy any sense of camaraderie. One powerful example of this solidarity can be found in the way enslaved people worked together to protect each other from the overseers. Enslaved families often had to rely on the support of their extended community to survive. If one person was singled out for punishment, others would step in to help them, whether through distracting the overseers, hiding them, or simply offering emotional support. This quiet solidarity formed the foundation of resistance. The enslaved may have been physically separated, isolated from one another by the sheer expanse of the plantation, but they were united in their desire for survival and for a better life. In addition to these forms of resistance, spirituals played a key role in helping enslaved people maintain their mental and emotional strength. These songs were more than just a way to pass the time. They were a vital means of psychological survival. Enslaved people would often sing spirituals while they worked, using the songs as a form of coded communication, a way to express their longing for freedom, their sorrow, and their hope. These spirituals were acts of rebellion in themselves, as they allowed enslaved people to voice their inner turmoil and yearning for a better future. Through these songs, they found a way to connect with their African roots, to affirm their humanity, and to remind themselves that they were not just slaves. They were people with emotions, desires, and a deep-seated hope for freedom. Spirituals also served as a form of collective resistance, allowing enslaved people to bond over shared experiences and create a sense of immunity even in the most oppressive of circumstances. In many ways, these small acts of defiance, whether stealing cotton, sabotaging the work process, or singing spirituals, were acts of survival. They allowed enslaved people to fight back, to assert their humanity, and to resist the system that sought to control every aspect of their lives. While these acts may not have led to large-scale uprisings, they were no less important. They were the quiet forms of rebellion that gave enslaved people a sense of agency, of control, and of hope. In a world designed to strip them of everything that made them human, these small rebellions allowed enslaved people to retain their dignity, their spirit, and their sense of self. Even in the face of overwhelming oppression, they found ways to fight back, no matter how small the act, no matter how risky. These acts of resistance, though quiet and subtle, were the foundation upon which the eventual abolition of slavery was built. The legacy of slavery is not just found in the historical accounts or the dusty pages of history books. It lives on in the stories of those who survived, resisted, and fought for their freedom. It is in the songs they sang, the families they formed, and the courage they showed in the face of unimaginable hardship. These stories are the bedrock upon which our understanding of resistance and survival during slavery is built. Every song, every story, every quiet act of defiance spoke to a deeper truth, that enslaved people, despite all efforts to break them, could never be fully subdued. One of the most powerful expressions of this resilience can be found in the words of Frederick Douglass, a former enslaved man who became one of the most prominent abolitionists in American history. Douglass once said, "The soul can be enslaved by chains, but not the spirit." This powerful statement captures the essence of what enslaved people faced during their lives on plantations. The physical chains that bound them were real, restricting their movement, their actions, and their freedom. But the spirit, that inner force that makes us human, could never truly be enslaved. In the face of the brutal systems that sought to crush their spirits, enslaved people found ways to resist. They did so not just by fighting back in the physical sense, but by preserving the very core of what made them human, their sense of identity, their dignity, and their unwavering belief in their right to be free. Despite every effort to break them, enslaved people maintained their dignity. Through the songs they sang in the fields, through the families they formed under the constant threat of separation, and through the quiet acts of resistance they performed daily, they held on to their humanity. The stories of those who survived and the resilience they displayed are not just footnotes in the history of slavery. They are the stories of a people who refused to let their spirit be crushed, no matter how heavy the chains. The songs they sang, often spirituals, were more than just expressions of faith. They were acts of resistance. The lyrics of these songs often contained veiled messages of hope and escape. They were a form of coded communication, a way of passing along information about the possibility of freedom. To the outside world, these spirituals may have seemed like songs of sorrow, but for those who sang them, they were a source of strength. They reminded the enslaved that freedom, while elusive, was not impossible. It was something they could reach for, even if it was just through their songs. Through these songs, enslaved people maintained a sense of community and identity. Even though their physical bodies were forced to labor under the supervision of cruel overseers, their spirit remained unbroken in the shared rhythm of the spirituals they sang. Music became a powerful form of resistance. It was a declaration that, despite being trapped in a system that saw them as nothing more than property, they were still human beings, with thoughts, feelings, and desires that could not be completely eradicated. But it was not just the songs. The very act of forming families in a system that sought to destroy familial bonds was an act of resistance in itself. Enslaved people were constantly at risk of losing their families, as individuals could be sold away to different plantations without warning. Yet, in the face of this constant threat, families were formed, nurtured, and held together with love and care. One of the most poignant and heartbreaking aspects of slavery was the way it tore families apart. Children could be sold away from their mothers, spouses separated from one another, and parents torn from their children. But even with the constant threat of separation, enslaved people found ways to maintain their familial ties. Mothers and fathers held their children close, even when they knew they could be taken away at any moment. They taught their children how to survive, how to endure the harshness of the world, and how to find hope in the darkest of times. Some enslaved people even went so far as to create their own unofficial marriages, jumping over a broomstick as a symbol of their commitment to one another. This symbolic act of jumping the broom became a powerful representation of their desire to live lives that were as close to normal as possible in an abnormal world. Though their marriages were not legally recognized, they were deeply meaningful to the enslaved people who formed them. It was a statement that, despite everything they were being subjected to, they would not allow the institution of slavery to strip away their ability to love, to form relationships, and to maintain a sense of family. These acts of familial resistance were often quiet, but incredibly powerful. By holding on to their families, by refusing to let the system tear them apart, enslaved people were making a statement about their inherent worth. They were saying, "We are not just property. We are people, with families, with love, with dreams for the future." This defiance in the face of a system designed to destroy their families is a testament to their strength and resilience. The courage that enslaved people showed in their fight for freedom was not always evident in dramatic uprisings or large-scale rebellions. In fact, many of the most powerful acts of resistance were small, personal, acts quiet but defiant, gestures of survival. Whether it was deliberately working slower, stealing food, or sabotaging the work process, these acts of resistance allowed enslaved people to regain some measure of control over their lives. But there were also more overt acts of resistance, such as running away or participating in organized revolts. Fugitive slaves who managed to escape to the north were often hailed as heroes, as their escape represented not just their personal freedom, but the possibility of freedom for all enslaved people. These acts of rebellion, while dangerous, were often carried out with the belief that true freedom was worth any cost. These individuals risked everything, their lives, their families, and their future, for the chance to live free from the oppressive system of slavery. Even those who did not escape or participate in organized revolts found ways to fight back. Their resistance was often rooted in everyday acts of survival, fighting to maintain their humanity in a world that treated them as less than human. Whether it was through the songs they sang, the families they formed, or the quiet resistance they practiced daily, enslaved people refused to let the system strip away their spirit. In the end, the true legacy of slavery lies not in the history of brutality and dehumanization, but in the resilience of those who survived it. The courage to fight for freedom, the ability to maintain one's dignity, and the strength to resist oppression are the true testaments to the human spirit. As Frederick Douglass said, "The soul can be enslaved by chains, but not the spirit." Enslaved people, despite the immense challenges they faced, maintained their dignity, their humanity, and their will to fight for freedom. Their legacy is one of hope, resilience, and the unyielding desire for freedom, an enduring reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can never be truly enslaved. While the institution of slavery may have formally ended with the Civil War, the scars it left are still visible today. The history of slavery in America is not just a series of events in dusty textbooks. It is woven into the fabric of our society, embedded in the lives of those who survived, and marked by the enduring impact it had on future generations. The echoes of the past can still be heard in the struggles for equality, justice, and freedom that continue today. Yet in the resilience of those who lived through this brutal history, their refusal to give up, their quiet acts of defiance, and their love for their families, we find a message of hope. Their ability to withstand unimaginable suffering, to endure the harshest conditions, and to continue to fight for their humanity is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Enslaved people lived under constant fear of punishment, separation, and dehumanization, but they never gave up. Even when the world around them sought to break them, they held on to their dignity and fought for a future where they could live freely. Their resistance was not always open or dramatic. It was often subtle, hidden in small acts of rebellion, in the songs they sang, and in the families they formed, despite the constant threat of separation. Their quiet acts of defiance, like slowing down in the fields, stealing food to feed their families, or sharing their stories in secret, were not just forms of survival. They were affirmations of their humanity, a refusal to accept the system that saw them as less than human. In these moments when they were most vulnerable, enslaved people found ways to express their strength. Their faith, their songs, and their family bonds became their weapons against the forces that tried to strip them of everything. The creation of families, the raising of children, and the preservation of cultural traditions were acts of resistance in themselves. By continuing to love, by continuing to care for each other, and by forming bonds that could not be broken by the system of slavery, they demonstrated the indomitable power of the human spirit. These acts of resistance, whether through the quiet solidarity of enslaved people helping each other in times of need, or through the physical fight for freedom, helped lay the groundwork for the abolition of slavery. The courage to resist, to survive, and to fight for freedom was not just a personal victory, it was a collective one. The resilience of enslaved people was a crucial force in dismantling the system of slavery, and their unwavering belief in the possibility of freedom fueled the movements that led to the eventual end of slavery in the United States. It is important to remember that the journey toward freedom did not end with the Civil War. The scars of slavery, both physical and psychological, were not easily healed. Even after emancipation, formerly enslaved people and their descendants faced unimaginable challenges: segregation, disenfranchisement, and the continued denial of basic human rights. Yet, even in the face of these new challenges, the legacy of resilience that had been forged during the time of slavery endured. Enslaved people did not just survive, they fought, resisted, and thrived. Their legacy lives on in the ongoing fight for racial equality and justice today. The resilience of those who endured slavery continues to inspire movements for social change and justice in modern times. Their refusal to accept oppression, their determination to maintain their dignity, and their commitment to their families serve as a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can endure, and it can thrive. The resilience of the enslaved also serves as a foundation for the freedoms we hold dear today. The struggle for civil rights, the fight for racial equality, and the demand for justice all have their roots in the resistance and resilience of enslaved people. While we acknowledge the hardships and trauma that slavery caused, we must also celebrate the strength and determination that emerged from it. It is through the stories of those who survived slavery and fought for freedom that we are reminded of the enduring power of the human spirit. These stories are not just about the past, they are living, breathing reminders of what it means to resist injustice and fight for freedom. The survivors of slavery, though many are no longer with us, have passed on their stories to future generations. Through the generations, their legacy continues to shape our society, reminding us that the fight for justice is ongoing. The courage they showed in the face of unthinkable hardship has inspired countless others to stand up for what is right, to push against systems of oppression, and to demand equality for all. We must honor their memory by continuing the fight for justice today. Slavery may have ended, but the fight for freedom, equality, and dignity is far from over. The struggles faced by enslaved people are not distant history. They are part of a larger, ongoing fight for human rights and social justice. As we look back on the lives of those who resisted slavery, we must remember that their resilience is not just a lesson from the past. It is a call to action for the present and the future. Let us remember the enslaved people, not just for their suffering, but for their courage, their love, and their determination to survive. Let us honor their resilience by ensuring that their struggle for freedom continues to inspire us to fight against injustice, wherever it exists. Their legacy is not just one of survival. It is one of triumph, of defiance, and of the power of the human spirit to endure no matter the odds. Thank you for watching. If you learned something today, please consider subscribing and sharing this video. Let us continue to honor the memory of those who lived through this brutal history and remember that their resilience helped lay the foundation for the freedoms we hold dear today. We stand on the shoulders of giants people who fought for their freedom, for their families, and for the future. Now, it is our turn to carry forward their legacy of resistance, survival, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. By acknowledging and remembering their struggles, we are not just honoring the past. We are ensuring that the fight for freedom, equality, and justice continues for generations to come.